Hi everybody, I hope you had a, what do they say, a meaningful Shavuos or B'Tammuz. That's the old question when people wish each other a tzom kal, an easy fast. So some say, well no, a fast is supposed to suffer, right? So I don't wish a tzom kal, but it should be a tzom of meaningfulness, and we hope and we pray, as the Navi Zechariah tells us, that all of these fast days, including of course the 9th of Av itself, will be converted into Sason v'Simcha, joyous days of celebration when the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt. It should be B'mheira v'yameinu. Rav Tzadok of Lublin has three interesting observations about the 3 weeks. I'll mention all three of them, and I'll only talk about one of them tonight. The first observation that he makes is that the 3 weeks and Tisha B'Av kind of corresponds to the redemptive cycle of Pesach in reverse. We know that we have the day of Pesach, the holiday of Pesach, which is a time of redemption, and we know that there were 4 Lashonot of Geula, 4 terms of redemption in connection with Pesach. Hotseisi, I will take you out, Vitzalti, I will save you, Viga'alti v'lokachti. Now it's interesting that Shavuos or B'Tammuz actually in many ways should have been the culmination of Pesach. How is that so? Because the whole purpose of Yetzias Mitzrayim was that we should get to Har Sinai and receive the Torah. Now, Hashem gave us the 10 Commandments on Shavuos, but what was the day that Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the Luchos 40 days later? It was the 17th of Tammuz. So the 17th of Tammuz would have been the day that Moshe Rabbeinu brings the Luchos to Klal Yisrael, had it not been for the Chet HaEgel, which caused Moshe Rabbeinu to smash the Luchos. Now, it is no accident, therefore, says Rav Tzadok, that the 17th of Tammuz is always the same day of the week as Pesach. This year it's thrown off because of Shabbos, but the 17th of Tammuz is the same day of the week as Pesach. Say again? Yeah, Pesach was on Shabbos, yeah. Yeah, last Pesach was on Shabbos, so the 17th of Tammuz was also on Shabbos, because the 17th of Tammuz, in a sense, would have been the culmination, would have been the very purpose, the realization of the tachlis of Yetzias Mitzrayim, because the tachlis, we spoke about this quite a few times, the purpose of freedom is the responsibility of receiving the Torah. Remember, I've used the metaphor from the poet Tagore, that we are like violin strings which have the capacity for beautiful music, but when a string is totally loose, it cannot make a sound. Only when it's tied down is the beautiful music within able to be revealed. So Shavuos or B'Tammuz would have been the culmination of Pesach. Instead, it turned into a journey away from God. So Rav Tzadok actually says the 3 weeks are a negative mirror image of 3 cups, meaning the 3 cups of redemption, the first 3, bring us closer and closer and closer to God, culminating in the 4th cup. The 3 weeks bring us further and further and further from God, culminating in Tisha B'Av, which is the 4th cup, the maximum distance and estrangement that we have from God. It's kind of a negative mirror image of the Arba Kosos. The Arba Kosos are the 4 cups of Geula. These are the 4 stages of Richuk, of distancing. The 3 weeks culminating in Tisha B'Av. But what is interesting about distancing is that we look at Galus as a circle, meaning to say we start at a certain point in the circle where we're together with God. The 2 points are touching, and then we're moving further and further and further away along the circumference of the circle. But the nature of a circle is that the further you move away on one side, the closer you're actually getting on the other side. And therefore, in many, many ways, the lesson of the 3 weeks is the paradox that's expressed in the English expression, Absence makes the heart grow fonder. As we become more and more aware of how far we are from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that very feeling of estrangement and distance causes a yearning and a love that is very, very powerful. In fact, Rav Hutner once said, the great Rav Hutner once said when he made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, was there anything he missed about Chutz La'aretz? And Rav Hutner, who was besides being a gadol and an enormous Talmud Chacham, was an extremely witty person as well. And Rav Hutner said, yeah, the thing he misses about living in Chutz La'aretz was the yearning to come to Eretz Yisrael. Because when he was in Chutz La'aretz, it was an all-consuming passion to be here. Once we're here, we take it for granted. Either we complain, or we see some of the difficulties of daily life. There is a concept that separation creates yearning, and therefore Rav Tzadok says the parallelism of the 3 weeks and Tisha B'Av to the 4 cups is, on one level, it's a reversal. You're moving away, 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 as opposed to the 4 cups in which you're getting closer, closer, closer. But in the process of moving away, you're actually getting closer at the same time. And that is the meaning of the well-known Maimer Chazal, that Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. Now, that doesn't have to be understood, that the person that will be Mashiach will be born on the 9th of Av. Certainly Chabad cannot understand it that way, because the Rebbe was not born on Tisha B'Av, he was born in Nisan. And even without Chabad, I mean, it doesn't have to be understood that literally, but rather it refers to a spiritual idea that koach that will bring Mashiach into the world is the yearning that we feel, the pining that we feel, because we're distant from God, as exemplified in Tisha B'Av, which is the highest level of richuk, and out of the yearning that comes from that richuk comes the greatest kiruv, and therefore that is the koach that brings Mashiach into the world. So that was Rav Tzadok thought number 1, in which he correlates the 3 weeks and Tisha B'Av to the 4 kosos. Rav Tzadok thought number 2, which I'm just going to say in 2 lines, in fact I'll leave it for next week's share, is that Rav Tzadok basically looks at the 3 weeks as a time when we eradicate 3 character flaws that create our estrangement from God. We know that Pirkei Avos tells us there are 3 positive factors that build up Kedusha. That is Torah, the study of Torah, Avoda, prayer and sacrifice, and Gemilas Chasadim, acts of loving kindness. Al Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Omed. The world stands on 3 pillars. Al Torah, Al Ha'avoda, V'al Gemilas Chasadim. Each of our avos exemplified those pillars. Avraham was the pillar of loving kindness, and Yitzchak, who was a korban, was the pillar of avoda, divine service. And Yaakov, who spent 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem v'Ever, not even sleeping, as Chazal tell us, represents the koach of Torah learning. Those are the 3 positive factors. But Pirkei Avos says, just as there are 3 positive factors that bring godliness and holiness into the world, there are 3 negative factors that destroy them, and that is hakina, envy, jealousy. Taiva is excessive lust for the material and sensual pleasure, and kavod, a desire for honor, glory, ego gratification, self-aggrandizement. What does Rabbi Elazar HaKapper say? Hakina v'ataiva v'akavod maitziin es ha'adam min ha'olam. They take a person out of the world. They destroy all of the good that a person could achieve. So Rav Tzadok says that the 3 weeks preparing us for the ultimate redemption that will be seen on Tisha B'Av with the birth of Mashiach, in a spiritual sense, the 3 weeks are a tikkun, a rectification for hakina, hataiva, v'hakavod. Okay, I will leave a fuller explanation of that for next week, but that's a second thought. So thought number 1 is the correlation of the 3 weeks and Tisha B'Av to the 4 cups, 4 lashonot of Geula, in kind of a reverse circle idea, that the further and further you get away from from a point on the circle, the closer you are to the other side. Point number 2 is the 3 weeks are keneged a tikkun of kina, taiva, v'kavod. By the way, let me put in a little commercial for a book that was written by someone that I know very well. I don't know if you've heard of Erica Brown. Erica Brown is a book written by a very, very fine woman in the Washington area. She lives in Silver Spring, but she's a very accomplished scholar and writer. And she wrote a book, I don't remember the name, but if you Google Erica Brown, you'll find it. It's a book on the 3 weeks, Bedafka, and she has for every single day of the 3 weeks a reflection about what one could think about and contemplate, a meditation. And then she also has some practical activity to implement during the 3 weeks. It's a very, very fine book, and would be, it's a worthwhile companion. People sometimes wonder, we look at the 3 weeks as kind of dreary restrictions. It gets worse with the 9 days, but you can't do this, can't do that, can't do that, and then 9 days, and we're always looking for ways out, and we're looking for leniencies, and I get, for some reason, question after question, can I buy this, can I do this, can I build this? It seems like a year's worth of activity seems to have to be done during these 3 weeks. I don't know why. Building and buying and doing, every single thing. But it's kind of a negative way of looking at it. When you just look at it as a bunch of do's and don'ts and restrictions, you don't see it and you don't perceive it as a spiritual exercise in trying to understand the nature of Galus, the nature of what it is that we're missing, what it is that we're mourning. In a way, the greatest sign of how bad we are, in other words, how much in trouble we are, is we don't even know what the problem is. Right? So this is a book that I think would be helpful. So you can look for it, Erica Brown's book on the 3 weeks. That's a little commercial, and I think I'll ask her for a commission a little later on. But that is the second thought of Rav Tzadok, that the 3 weeks are keneged hakina v'hataiva v'hakavod. Now the third thought of Rav Tzadok, which is the main thing I do want to talk about, is he focuses on the haftorahs for the 3 weeks. And it's very interesting that, for most of the parshiot, we always have a haftorah on Shabbos, something from the prophets. I used to think when I was very young that haftorah sounded to me like half Torah. So I made a connection, which I thought was pretty smart, that, okay, the real Torah is full Torah, and this other thing we read is like half Torah. It's not that important. But then, when I heard Havdalah, didn't carry through. But be it as it may, the Haftorah is a takanas chachamim, that side by side with a Torah reading, we have something from the prophets. Now, this is in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says such a law, but the Mishnah does not dictate which Haftorah goes with which parsha. That was left to every congregation to decide on their own. And that is why, to this day, there are many, many different minhagim of haftorahs. There's Ashkenazi, there's Sephardi, there's Teimani, there's Italki, there is Yeki, all sorts of things. Because Chazal really didn't care. As long as it had something to do with the Parsha, or the Yom Tif, whatever it would be, they allowed you to do whatever you want. But there are some exceptions. Chazal did say that the 3 Shabbatot before Tisha B'Av, you have to have 3 very specific haftorahs that are connected to tragedy and perennials. So the haftorahs we're going to start reading this coming Shabbos, and 2 more haftorahs, are actually mandated by Chazal in Maseches Megillah. And Rav Tzadok focuses simply on the first words of each of those haftorahs. The haftorah we're going to read this coming Shabbos is the beginning of the book of Yirmiyahu. Divrei Yirmiyahu, the words of Jeremiah. So, the operative topic word there is dibor, speech. The second haftarah, the week after, is also from Yirmiyahu, and it begins with Shimu Devar Hashem. Listen to Devar Hashem. So haftarah number 1 is speech. Haftarah number 2 is hearing. And then the last Haftorah, the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, actually it is Tisha B'Av, but the day before we observe the fast, is the one that is not from Yirmiyahu. It's the first chapter of Isaiah, of Yeshayahu, and that begins with Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Isaiah. So Rav Tzadok says there's a progression here that goes to the idea of say no evil, hear no evil, see no evil. It reverses the order of the expression. And therefore the idea is, one of the spiritual ideas here is, number one is, let us control our speech, the way we describe people in terms of Lashon Hara. But then you progress to a higher level in which not only do you control and moderate your speech, but you also try to avoid listening to what other people say. But there's a higher level than that, and that is to change your perception of reality, in which you strive to see the good and the positive. Because ultimately that is the only long-term strategy for Lashon Hara that truly works. Because if you think negatively about people, you think he's a bum and he's a bum and he's no good, but you have the inner discipline of biting your tongue, well, after a while your tongue is going to bleed. Meaning to say, if I truly look at people in a negative, derogatory way, but I control myself, then at some point I'm going to break down. But when you change your perceptions of reality, then you look at people in a very, very different way. And that is, you're not oblivious to shortcomings. I'm not referring to the naivete in which you make believe everybody's the tzaddik of the generation. That's an unrealistic type of modality. But rather, there's a way in which you try to understand where people are coming from. And then you recognize, as the saying goes, people who hurt, hurt. Meaning people who have been hurt in their lives, hurt others. And then you realize that if people are behaving a certain way towards you, there are probably factors in their life that made them that way. I think I had mentioned before, Rav Moshe Cordovero recommends a certain exercise that you should imagine people, turn the clock back when you encounter difficult people, rude people, mean people, inconsiderate people. Try to imagine a time in their lives where they hadn't yet reached that state. Turn the clock back. Imagine them as children. Imagine them as babies. Usually there was some point in their life that they were cute and adorable. Now maybe you have to go back pretty far. But when they were 6 months, they were cute, they were adorable. And then something happened. They became what they are. How did that happen? Well, we obviously don't know. But Rav Moshe Cordovero says that's a meditation that can change anger and resentment to compassion and mercy. Because then I tell myself, such a beautiful little boy, and what a bad person he became. What happens? And then that's ma'orer rachmanut, a whole different type of feeling. So there's a certain trajectory in which initially I control my speech. And then I try to control the inputs to me from others that create negativity. And then ultimately, I try to refine my perception of reality. Again, I'm not talking about the extreme evil. I'm not talking about how to look at Hitler. I'm not dealing with that particular case, although...
It also includes...
again, I don't want to go there in particular, but, to some degree it may even include that. But certainly, if we deal with the daily irritants that come in our way, of course, we might be a daily irritant to somebody else, but whatever it would be, then usually you're not dealing with radical evil. You're dealing with a lack of consideration. You're dealing with people who are not as thoughtful as they ought to be, people who are perpetually grouchy. And then, indeed, if we turn back the clock, so to speak, we could have a different perception. And ultimately, that is how we get out of the Lashon Hara modality, not so much by controlling our speech, but by changing our perception of how we look at people in the world. But be it as it may, this week is the first stage, controlling our speech, because the Haftarah begins, Divrei Yirmiyahu, the words of Yirmiyahu. And of course we all know that what's called the Koach HaDibur, the power of speech, is very, very strong. In fact, the famous Targum Onkelos, when the Chumash says, God breathed into Adam Ruach Chaya, a spirit of life. Life. The Targum says, Ruach Memalala, a power of speech. And it's not so much the physiological process of speech, but speech connotes a certain capacity of abstract thought that can be communicated, that can be articulated. There is something distinctly very, very elevating about this. But at the same time, Shlomo HaMelech says in Mishlei, famous verse, Hamaves v'hachayim biyad halashon. That means life and death is in the hands of the tongue. The tongue creates life, the tongue creates death. The pasuk in the Medrash in Mishlei gives a story that illustrates this. Again, it's a Medrash. The Medrash says all of the limbs of the body were arguing who was considered to be the most important. You know, the brain said, I'm the most important because I control everything. The legs say, I'm the most important. They're actually talking to each other. Without me, you can't go anywhere. The arms and hands were saying, I'm the most important. Without me, you can't grasp. So finally, the tongue says, I'm the most important. So they started laughing at the tongue because they said to the tongue, you don't even have a backbone. You can't even stand up. You're just lying prone. How can you have any significance whatsoever? So the tongue said, I will show you all how important I am. So apparently this person works for the king, and the king was ill, and the person goes to the king and says, a man like you ought to drink the milk of a dog and you'll get better. Apparently that was a very disrespectful thing to say. So the king says, kill this man. He talks to me, he calls me a dog, he says, a dog like you ought to drink the milk of a dog. So, at this point, all of the limbs are panicking, we're going to die. And the tongue says, this is all in Medrash, the tongue says, I told you I could get you killed if I wanted. Now, I'll get you out of it. And the tongue says, the person says to the king, oh, your majesty, in my language, the word that you thought was dog actually means courageous lion. It's just a question of a different language. And I was saying, a courageous man like you should have the milk of a lioness. So the king said, oh, that's what you meant? You're off the hook. So the tongue, so the tongue is a fanciful story, but the tongue says to the other limbs, you see, I could get you killed, and I can give you life. This illustrates the verse, Hamavet v'hachayim, death and life are biyad halashon. But for our purposes, it's not so much that particular story. We have to realize that the power of speech gives life and death, not only for the speaker. Obviously, a speaker could say words, depending on which country you are, that can get you killed or can get you life, but also the effect we have on others. We can use our power of speech to build up others, to give them courage, to give them strength, to give them confidence, to give them hope. Words can build life, and words can destroy. Not so much physically killing somebody, but words can break a person's spirit. The words, the denigrating words that a child can hear from a teacher or a parent can haunt that child all of his life. In fact, I still remember, we have the childhood saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. It's really not true. I remember seeing an interview with Richard Nixon after he had left the presidency. And, Richard Nixon had been through quite a lot, and he put the United States, through quite a lot, although with respect to Israel, he was, pretty good. And Richard Nixon all of a sudden started talking about playground taunts in the 6th grade. I mean, he was a man who was president of the United States, and he was forced to resign, etc., and he had been through so many things. And at his age, he was already in his mid or late 70s. He's thinking about those things. Meaning, there are decisions that are made in the world today that affect the whole world, that are based on the hurt feelings that people had as children. We think as we grow up we escape that. That's kid stuff. We really don't. It kind of stays with us. It's scary, and it's in many ways it's illogical. And yet it is the psychological reality that, even if you're a president, even if you're a king, even if you're an emperor, even if you have your finger on a nuclear button, the playground taunts are going to be a factor in the decisions you make, in how you interact with people. It's going to be there with you. Very scary. And I include the current U.S. president as perhaps an example of that as well. So we have to recognize how powerful speech is, how we can build and create hope and confidence and goodness. Now there was, again, I hesitate to say this, to give this example, because some people have said it's been discredited. So I do know that there's some controversy whether it's true. But an experiment was reported around 25 years ago, looking at molecules of water under an electron microscope, which could actually show the individual molecules of water. And when people spoke harsh words, the molecules assumed like ugly configurations. And when people spoke gentle words, the molecules assumed beautiful, snowflake-like patterns, to indicate that even the physical world itself, the physical structure of reality, responds to kindness versus cruelty. Now, number one, I have 2 points about that. Number one, some people have claimed that was a made-up experiment, so I can't state it as scientific reality.
When they froze water,
yeah,
and they found different designs within the frozen water. This is true. There are...
no, there are different designs. No, that I understand. But the question is whether those designs are a function of the positive or the negative words. The other possibility is that even if you assume that the patterns did shift shape, it may not have been because of mean versus good. It may have simply been because people who speak cruel words just do it louder. In other words, it may be the sound waves as opposed to the content, and that I think also. Now, you'd have to have in order to prove this point, you would have to have the words at the same modulation level, and then we would say, the water is responding to kindness versus cruelty, as opposed to loud versus quiet. And as we know, angry words tend to be louder than kind words, and that throws off the experiment a little bit. But be it as it may, whether we have a scientific proof or not, I think all of us know that in human relationships, the vibes are genuine, that the idea of using words to comfort and to strengthen and to build up is really a tremendous idea. And therefore, the notion of all of these laws against Lashon Hara and the like, the purpose is not that we should keep quiet all the time. That would be an abdication of one of our greatest gifts. But rather to utilize words in positive and constructive ways. When the Chafetz Chaim wrote his famous work on the laws of Lashon Hara, so there were some rabbis that were very suspicious of him. They said, who is this guy that can write a book about not speaking Lashon Hara? Everybody speaks Lashon Hara. And they wanted to check him out to see if he was living by the standards that he was espousing. So they would send spies. They actually would send people to spend Shabbos with the Chafetz Chaim to see, and actually entrapment, to entrap him, as it were, to say Lashon Hara or whatever it is. Are you allowed to do it? That's a good question, but they wanted to check it out. So there was a rabbi that was there, a young rabbi, and he noticed two things. The Chafetz Chaim had a son-in-law who was such a righteous person that he wouldn't talk at all. He would only say Torah and tefillah, he did not talk. The Chafetz Chaim was very talkative. So at first glance, the rabbi thought, gee, why do people make such a big deal about the Chafetz Chaim? The son-in-law seems to be much more righteous. He guards his tongue with such meticulousness. But then he realized that in spite of the fact that the Chafetz Chaim was not at all inhibited in his communication, he never crossed the line in prohibited Lashon Hara. And therefore he realized that was a greater level. To simply close your mouth, bite your tongue, is a high level, to be sure, but it's not as high as using your power of speech in good and constructive ways. Now, what's interesting is the connection to the power of speech is not only in the Haftarah, it's in the Torah itself, the Parsha reading of the Torah itself. The Torah begins, this is the Parsha that deals with the notion of Neder and Shavua. Now the Torah says that if I make an oath or a vow, these are technically two different formulations. An oath, which is called a Shavua, is when a person swears in the name of God that they will do something or they will not do something. So a person could swear, I will eat 2 apples a day, or they could swear, I will not eat chocolate. And you can make it for a time limit. You can say for the next week. You can do it any way you want. But that is a shavua, and the Torah says once you make a shavua, you must keep it. Lo yachel divaro. You may not profane your word. That's the negative commandment. And the positive is kachol hayotzei mipiv yaseh. Everything that comes out of your mouth, Yaseh, you must do. So if a person violates a shavua, they have transgressed a negative commandment and a positive commandment, as well as possibly taking God's name in vain, which is really a separate category. Now a neder is essentially the same thing, but it's a different verbal formulation. A shavua is phrased in terms of the person. I will not eat chocolate, or I will eat an apple. A neder is in terms of the object. Apples are forbidden to me. In the language of the Gemara, shavua is iser gavra, the person prohibits himself. Neder is iser chefza, the object is prohibited. Now you might say, that doesn't seem like a very, very important difference. That's just a matter of how you say it. I just want to mention as an aside that there is a major, monumental, halachic difference between a neder and a shvua, and that is whether it's effective to annul a mitzvah. For example, if a person made a shvua, I'm not going to eat matzah on Pesach. I make a shvua, I am not going to eat matzah. I make a shavua, I am not going to wear tefillin. The shavua is null and void. It is null and void. You cannot make a shavua to abrogate a commandment of the Torah, in the language of the Gemara, because you already swore at Mount Sinai to keep the Torah. A second shavua going against that is not valid. So if a person made a shavua, I'm not going to wear tefillin, we would simply tell him, your shavua is null and void, wear tefillin. Now, what if, however, instead of phrasing his prohibition as a shavua, I will not eat matzah, I will not wear tefillin, he phrased it as a neder. Tefillin are forbidden to me. Matzah is forbidden to me. Strangely enough, although he is absolutely not allowed to do that because he's abrogating a mitzvah and he has to go to a beis din to get annulment, but until he does that, his neder is valid, and he is not allowed to wear tefillin, and he is not allowed to eat matzah. And the difference is, shavua is a frontal, direct contradiction to your commitment. God said at Sinai, you wear tefillin. When you make a statement, I will not wear tefillin, that's a contradiction. But when you say it, tefillin is forbidden to me, that's called an indirect confrontation, so to speak. So what starts off as, I don't want to get into the halachas too much because it's a technical area, but I just want to point out that don't just assume this is a minor semantic trick. This semantic distinction has enormous distinctions in terms of whether it is effective to abrogate a commandment of the Torah. Be it as it may, whether it's neder or shavua, what do you see? What is unique about neder or shavua? It is the power of speech to create a spiritual, metaphysical reality that didn't exist. I mean, after all, we normally assume that God prohibits things. They become spiritually damaging in one way or the other. God prohibits treif. Now, if I make a neder or a shvua, I'm not going to eat chocolate, then eating chocolate becomes the same thing for me as eating a piece of pork. I literally changed, through my speech, the spiritual, metaphysical nature of that which a second ago was permitted and has now become prohibited. In a sense, the power to make neder or shavua is the godlike power to effectively add to the Torah. You have added to God's list of prohibited foods things of your own nature. So, in a sense, it is a metaphor for the power of speech to create new realities that did not exist prior to that neder or prior to that shvua. Now, as I say, it's actually improper to do that. We are told, it says in Koheles, better not to make a vow than to make a vow that you might break. And that's why we always say, any commitment, it's boli neder, it's not a vow, etc. It's an important idea because vows are very, and oaths as well, shvuos, nedorim, they are very, very highly discouraged. Because if you break them, the sin is very, very severe. But nevertheless, neder is the epitome of the power to create realities through the koach of dibur. But there's another connection to the power of speech, and that is in the reference to the cities of refuge, which is not in this week's parsha, it's next week's parsha, but I'll often, the parshios are combined, so I'll give myself reshus to mention. Now the Ir Miklat is a very interesting institution. A person kills inadvertently, so he does not get the death penalty, but in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there were designated cities of refuge called Arei Miklat that a person would go to, and he would be protected from the wrath of the blood avenger, but he would have to remain in that city, very strange sentence, indeterminate sentence, until the Kohen Gadol dies. Now that could be a short amount of time, that could be a long amount of time. If the Kohen Gadol dies one day after the murderer went to the Ir Miklat, he goes free after one day. If the Kohen Gadol lives for another 50 years, the Rotseach would have to wait 50 years. If the Rotseach dies before the Kohen Gadol, he is buried in the Ir Miklat, not to be exhumed until the Kohen Gadol dies. It's an indeterminate sentence. First of all, the Lubavitcher Rebbe has a nice ha'ara. The Lubavitcher Rebbe points out that Arei Miklat is the closest we have to what you might call a prison system in the Torah's penology. Right? The Torah does not normally send people to jail. We have death penalties, we have lashes, we have financial compensation, we have fines, but we don't have a system of sending people to jail. The only reference to jail in the Torah besides Paro is when Moshe didn't know what to do with somebody, he put the person in a kind of a prison until he found out, but that was not the permanent punishment. But the closest idea we have to some type of confinement is the city of refuge. Now, that's not really a prison. The city of refuge is a city, But he can't leave that city. If he leaves the city anytime before the Kohen Gadol dies, the Goel Adam is given carte blanche permission to kill him. If the Goel Adam kills him in the city of refuge, he committed murder. If he kills him when the Rotzeach takes a step out of the city of refuge, perfectly okay.
And if he kills in self-defense, he kills the blood of him?
Yes, that's an interesting... He is not. That's an interesting question. Even when the Goel Adam has the right to kill him, the Rotzeach can fight back in self-defense, and if he kills him, he does not get punished for that. In fact, the Gemara even says it by Pinchas. When Pinchas was killing Zimri, if Zimri would have killed Pinchas, Zimri would have been exempt, because Pinchas would have the halacha of a rodef, someone trying to kill me, and the like. Very interesting. Even when the homicide is justifiable, the victim can resist and claim that the law of the pursuer. Okay, now, the question is this. The question that the Bavli asks is, why should the Rotzeach's sentence be dependent on the Kohen Gadol? And the Gemara says in Maseches Makos, because the Kohen Gadol is responsible for what the Rotzeach did. How so? Because the Kohen Gadol was said to be the spiritual leader of the generation, and it was his job to pray that calamities not occur on his watch. And if calamities did occur on his watch, he is considered to be morally responsible for the tragedies that occur, right? Because the power of his prayer could have averted these tragedies. That's what the Gemara in the Bavli says. Now, the Mishnah then goes on and says that the mothers of high priests used to send food packages to the people in the Ir Miklat, care packages, in order that they shouldn't pray that the Kohen Gadol dies. Because after all, they would pray the Kohen Gadol would die because that gets them out. The food package was like a bribe. So the Gemara asks the Kasha, the implication is if they would have prayed that the Kohen Gadol would die, somehow that prayer might be effective. Why would it be effective? So listen to this machlokas between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. The Bavli answers, the prayer against the Kohen Gadol would have been effective because the Kohen Gadol, as I said a moment ago, is culpable because he should have prayed that these calamities not take place. So it's a double prayer thing. The prayer of the murderer that the Kohen Gadol should die would have been effective because the Kohen Gadol deserved to die because he failed to pray to avert those tragedies. That's what the Bavli says. The Talmud Yerushalmi says, on the same question, meaning, why would the prayer of the murderer be effective if the Kohen Gadol didn't do anything wrong? So the Bavli's approach is he did something wrong by not praying, etc. The Yerushalmi says something that's even more startling. A prayer that is given with complete heart, Lev Shalem, is effective, or may be effective, even against a person who's totally blameless. Yes, the Kohen Gadol didn't do anything wrong, but a prayer offered against him may nonetheless be effective. So I want to just spend a moment here to analyze the difference in orientation between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and how under both views you see the power of tefillah, which is the koach of dibur, the koach of speech. First of all, this idea that the Kohen Gadol's prayer could have averted tragedy, it's not so clear here, because keep in mind the following very important halachic point. The murderer that goes to the Ir Miklat is not a person who killed somebody by an unavoidable accident. If, for example, somebody falls off a building and falls on a child, killing the child, you don't go to the Ir Miklat. That's called unavoidable accident. Every case of Ir Miklat is what we would call in legal terms manslaughter, some type of negligence, carelessness, unintentional but careless, going through a red light or a stop sign, not looking both ways at an intersection, throwing some heavy garbage, throwing something metal out of your window without looking who is below. In other words, Ir Miklat is not for accidents. Ir Miklat is for carelessness and negligence. Again, what is in legal term for that would be manslaughter, right? Murder is intentional murder. Manslaughter is careless homicide. Unavoidable accidents, you don't go to the Ir Miklat. So here's the thing. Since we have a klal that says, Hakol bidei shamayim, everything is decreed by God, right? Tsunamis are acts of God, one way or the other. Whether you look at it as directly mandated by God or a consequence of God creating nature, that's another machlokas. But the decisions that people make are not mandated by God. They are functions of free will. So how could the Kohen Gadol pray that people shouldn't be careless? People's carelessness is a function of the abdication of their responsibility. So how can the Bavli suggest, Kohen Gadol is culpable because he should have prayed that these tragedies should not occur on his watch? Well, if the tragedies would be accidents or acts of God, okay, that's something perhaps you can pray for, that God should intervene or whatever. But if we're talking about the evil that human beings make as a result of their own decisions, that's Hakol bidei shamayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven, chutz miyiras shamayim, except for the moral decision. So the Chazon Ish says, you see from the Bavli an amazing thing, that prayer is so potent that you can actually pray that God guide human actors in making responsible and good decisions. In other words, you can pray that this driver look both ways when he's at an intersection. You can pray that he doesn't throw garbage out of his window without looking who's below. In other words, prayer can override the principle of free will in the universe. And as a result, the Chazon Ish says, you can pray that someone does tshuva. Right? Let's say a person has a child that is off the derech, unfortunately. So we often tell the person, pray that God should inspire them to do tshuva. Now there's a philosophical problem with that, because the decision to do tshuva is a function of free will, and free will is left to the human actor. Now, maybe you could say, well, okay, I'm not praying that God should make him do tshuva, but maybe I'm praying that God should give him experiences that have a probability of inspiration. That's one way of looking at it. In other words, you're not praying, Hashem, make him do tshuva. Maybe that doesn't work. But Hashem expose him to things that may move him in a certain direction. That's one answer. But the Chazon Ish says, very, very directly, prayer can override free will, and you can pray that Hashem should, just like Hashem hardened Paro's heart, Hashem could put into somebody the idea of tshuva. So that's what you see from the Bavli, the idea that the koach of prayer is so enormous that it can actually override another fundamental law of spiritual reality, and that is Bechira, and that is why the Kohen Gadol is held responsible for the negligent homicides of his generation.
Pray enough.
Didn't pray enough. Now, Yeah.
Is there tefillah like that?
I didn't hear you.
Is there tefillah for the Kohen Gadol for tefillah?
Well, there's no particular text, but generally, he could have prayed for that. Now, the Yerushalmi takes a different tack. The Yerushalmi does not assign blame or culpability to the Kohen Gadol. Perhaps because the Yerushalmi says you can't blame the Kohen Gadol for the irresponsible volitional decisions of people who don't look both ways at intersections and run over a child. But the Yerushalmi highlights the power of prayer another way by basically saying, yeah, he doesn't deserve any punishment, but a prayer will get him anyway. Meaning, that's even scarier. The koach of prayer, could, if it's sincere, belev shalem, could call down the wrath of God, even on someone that is not morally deserving of any blemish. Now that is a problematical idea, because that would, God forbid, suggest even an idea that when you have terrorists who pray to God that they should be successful. Would God give them success? Again, that's a problematical idea, but the Yerushalmi indicates that a prayer belev shalem has a certain power even if it's offered by a wicked person with no justification. Now, most of the time wicked people don't offer prayers to God with a complete heart, but hypothetically, if a wicked person offers the prayer belev shalem, it will have kind of a dark spiritual energy and a power. So both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, you see this enormous koach of tefillah. One is tefillah can override bechira, that's the Bavli's perspective. And the other is tefillah could even be effective against somebody who's not guilty of anything in particular. Now, there is a Gemara in Kedushin. Again, this is a story. It's hard to understand the story literally. The Gemara says there was an abandoned building in a certain city, and this building was inhabited by a demon of 7 heads. And anyone that slept in that building would be killed. Nobody would go into the building. It was very, very dangerous. And the rabbis of the city, the chachamim of the city, didn't know what to do about this demon that was stalking the city. So Abaya said, I tell you what, there's a great tzaddik, Rav Dimi, that's coming to town, and he surely will be able to handle it. So when he needs lodging, nobody should give him any lodging, forcing him to sleep in this abandoned building, and then he will confront the demon. So Rav Dimi shows up, he needs a place to stay, everybody says, don't have room, so no brera, he sleeps in this abandoned building. This demon comes, this frightening 7-headed monster, and Rav Dimi prays, and every prayer a head of the demon gets lopped off, and finally the demon is killed. And the next day he goes to Abaya and says, why did you put me up in this building? I mean, you exposed me to this monster? So Abaya says, don't worry, I knew your tefillos would protect you. So the Marsha asks a question. The Gemara says that when you benefit from open miracles in this world, supernatural miracles, that reduces your olam haba because it's otherworldly. So even if Abaya was permitted to make the assumption that Rav Dimi would be saved by miraculous means, let's say Abaya was so sure that he could make that assumption, but what gives him the right to take away Rav Dimi's olam haba by making Rav Dimi have a miracle? So the Marsha's answer is, anything you get by prayer does not have the halachic status of a miracle, because it is the nature of prayer to bring miraculous things into the world. So the rule, so to speak, that miracles take away your olam haba do not apply to miracles that come through the power of prayer. Now, this is reminiscent of actually a famous story with Winston Churchill and the Ger Rebbe. Again, they say it didn't happen, but this is a story that is a very well-known story. That is, at some point, after the Ger Rebbe was smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto, the story goes he met Winston Churchill. Again, there's a lot of problems with the Rebbe, as far as you know, was never in London, but somehow he met Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill heard that this was a holy man, a righteous man, who could perhaps give him spiritual counsel. And this is during the Battle of Britain. This is a very, very difficult time. So Churchill says to the Rebbe, we're going through a very difficult time. We don't know if we're going to make it. We don't know if we're going to survive. We don't know if Western civilization is going to survive. How do we combat the evil that Hitler and Nazism represents? Again, obviously it was through an interpreter in Yiddish. So the Ger Rebbe said, I can give you a supernatural way of doing it, and I can give you a normal way of doing it. Which do you want to hear? So Churchill said, tell me both. So the Ger Rebbe said, the supernatural way would be, you have your army, your navy, your bombers, and for you to defeat the Nazis based on your numbers and based on your army, that would be a supernatural miracle. The natural way of doing it is, go into a corner and say the Psalms and ask God to help you. That'll be the normal. The normal will be the prayer. The supernatural would be the military force. And that's what the Maharsha is saying. What happens through prayer is considered to be normal, basically. And this is the koach of prayer. So, B'kitzer, therefore, everything is connected to the power of speech. The Haftorah deals with the power of speech, the ability to use your mouth, use your talking, to strengthen people, build them up, give them encouragement, and the negative power of speech to destroy and to devastate. We have the parsha of Neder and Shavua, where the power of speech creates new metaphysical, spiritual realities. And finally, we have the interesting machlokas between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi regarding why would the prayer against the Kohen Gadol be efficacious? And that's why they had to be bribed. The Bavli says, because the Kohen Gadol's prayer could have changed the wrong decisions that people make. The Yerushalmi says, even if the Kohen Gadol is not culpable, he could be vulnerable to that prayer. So we have to know that both speech and prayer are very, very precious gifts that God has given us, and we should use them to the maximum. But one final point about tefillah that one needs to keep in mind, and that is, all of us understand that prayers are not always answered in the specific way that we want them to be answered. This, I think, we have to know. And if I could quote the words of the great sage Mick Jagger, maybe shouldn't say it in a show. You can't always get what you want, but you get what you need. And that is actually a very profound spiritual idea, that God is not simply at our beck and call to give us whatever we want. We pray and we ask God for mercy, and often He will give us what we ask for, but often He will not. But people do die. There are sick people who do not recover. Tragedies happen. But the meaning of a prayer is not always in the specific answer that God gives you. Sometimes a prayer is answered by God giving you the strength to recover from your tragedy, to go on, to rebuild, to put one step in front of the other step, not to be broken. After the Holocaust, people lost their families, they lost loved ones, but many had the courage to start again from the very bottom and build something beautiful. That's also God answering a prayer. It's not answering the prayer in the direct thing that you were asking for, but Hashem answers prayers in many, many, many ways. So we have to understand that we shouldn't judge a prayer by whether the very specific thing we wanted was given to us. There are many, many ways in which prayers are answered. So again, may all of our tefillas taka be answered with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's rachamim. Good night.
Yiboneh